Hi.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry. I'm Gail Straker. I'm the community manager for Lipedema Simplified, and welcome to our webinar. I'm going to turn the show over to Carrie Reedy because she's one of my favorites. Go for it, Carrie.
Oh, and I thought we were going to chitter chatter. That's one of the things
Okay.
that we
We
love
can
to
chit
do here at
chat.
Lipedema Simplified, don't we?
Yeah, we can chat. Sorry, I'm in my running the show mode, which is kind of crazy. And I do want to encourage everybody who is out there listening and here on this webinar just to put their name and their uh, where they're from, and give us some love today because we're out here um, ourselves feeling a little lonely. We don't see any comments yet. So anyway, hi
Oh, well,
Carrie.
that's okay. It's Friday night for you there in the US. People may be having all sorts of other things to do. By the end of the work week, I don't know about you, but by the end of the work week, I'm like, take a breath and just start thinking about, enjoying the weekend and spending time together. And so certainly, this is going to be recorded and people can listen in later. But I think it's an interesting conversation that we're going to talk about today, Gail, and that is, you've started keto, what's next? Oh, that's why somebody's saying it's silent at their end.
That's interesting because I hear
Yeah,
you. Hi, Gail and Carrie.
yeah.
Hi, Peggy. Peggy, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Please.
No.
Or if anybody can hear me. Okay, I got a thumbs up. Okay. So in Viro Girl, I would like 18. I would like you to double check your sound. Make sure that you have your computer sound on. I know that there you go. She says she can hear us now. Woo, woo,
Ah.
woo. Okay. Viro Girl, what city are you from? Because apparently it took a while for the sound to get there. We were speaking faster than the sound. So
Oh,
sorry,
this is some
I'm
of the
just
joys of
around.
technology, isn't it? That we just assume everything's going to do everything as we expect, and it doesn't always work. Exactly right.
No,
No, no. Well, now that everyone can
okay.
hear us, it's lovely to have you with us. It's an interesting conversation to have. Many people, when they come to a diagnosis of something like lipedema, they start, Googling, researching, listening to what other people are sharing of what's helped, which is wonderful. And that's the benefit of community, that rather than waiting for this information to get dispelled from the top down in terms of through, the medical research and through our doctors, we're actually a grassroots movement that's moving from the bottom up, I suppose, in terms of what we're finding helps and makes a difference for lipedema. And so many people come to this and say, well, okay, keto is going to be helpful. It works for other people. Here, I'm going to give it a try. And I guess one of the things that I would say about this as a nutritionist is there is no one size fits all keto. And really, we do ultimately need to personalize this for us. And the way that our friends done keto and has had amazing benefits may not necessarily be the way that we need to do keto, or the way that we need to tackle our nutrition at all in terms of us and our biochemistry. And so I guess the conversation today is for those that are new to the diagnosis and wondering about keto. It's for those that have tried keto in the past or that are trying keto now and think, well, maybe there's some other things I need to think about. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So hopefully it'll be an interesting conversation, and we'll certainly open it up for some questions at the end. So if you have any questions as we go through this, please put them in the chat and we'll come back to them.
Yeah, and I find, Carrie, that so many people have a bad view on what keto is, because there's a thing called what what we lovingly call internet keto. And that's
Mm,
not necessarily when you're eating keto for your
mm,
health, not
mm.
necessarily what you're finding on the internet, because there's so many keto is a term that we throw around that
Yeah, yeah.
really doesn't have a strong definition in just the general world, right?
That is
And
so true. That is so true. And I think because of some of those ways that it's been put forward, that there are, say, many in our medical community that have sort of have a negative view of keto, that they think that we're going to cause all sorts of damage to our body. But I think what we have to remember is that going back ancestrally, there would have been many times across the year when our bodies would have been naturally in ketosis. I think about those of you that live in climates like you do, Gail, where snow covered during the winter, for instance, there wouldn't have been a lot of vegetables and plant matter around, and you would have been, your ancestors there would have been hunting animals and eating more, potentially more protein, less vegetables. The body would have naturally gone into a state of ketosis where it was using the excess that's stored in your body over the summer after it's eaten all of the lush fruits and things that are around in the
right,
summer. And we would have actually naturally had this wave of
right,
more ketosis potentially in the winter and more carbohydrate heavy, for instance, in the summer. So it's not that our bodies aren't able to do this. Our bodies have a mechanism to do what we're trying to do. We're just in many ways trying to replicate that winter phase, if you like, and allow our body to come in and use what it's stored away, rather than keep feeding it those carbohydrate rich foods that are potentially encouraging us to store things in our body.
right, right. So, Carrie, are you ready for me to pull up the slides?
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure.
Okay, I'm going to pull up the slides and then I'm going to step into the background as
Oh,
soon as they come
okay.
up.
You're leaving me in charge. That's always a little bit
Well, okay, then how about if I mute myself at least?
Oh. Okay. So like I said, we're going to be talking a little bit about, some of the other things that we need to be thinking about once we've either started keto, whether we've been doing keto for a while, maybe if we're not getting all of the results from keto that we think we should be. And we're going to kind of chat through some of these aspects of a ketogenic diet. Earlier in the week, Gail and I caught up and we talked about why testing out keto can be beneficial for lipedema. And I think that's an important part of this conversation as well, that we are simply testing it out. There has been a number of different dietary regimes that are recommended for helping support someone with either lipedema or lymphedema. We're finding the most anecdotal evidence is coming from our community in terms of testing out keto, low carb eating. But it's not always the ultimate destination. It's really, I say to people, it's a great starting point. And then there's some other factors that we need to consider. And they're the things that we're going to be chatting about today. Oops, my picture's just disappeared off this slide, but I was just going to tell you that I'm a university qualified nutritionist, and I'm particularly passionate about helping people with lipedema because of the way that this has impacted me and my family. And it's given me an opportunity to really delve into the benefits that a ketogenic diet can play in helping to manage many of the symptoms that come along with lipedema. I've been living I guess you'd say, a ketogenic lifestyle for a number of years now. I feel good eating this way. Many of the benefits that I've seen are the sorts of benefits that you will enjoy eating this way. Improved energy, less cravings. I certainly was a chocoholic back in my earlier days, and I do find that for the most part, those cravings, those really intense, feed me kind of feelings, really they take a sort of it's like the dial has been turned down, which is really helpful. It enables us to ditch the diet mindset and enjoy food again. And I think this is another really key thing many of us in this community have spent, gosh, probably not just years, but even decades dieting, trying to do everything that our medical community would tell us to do to lose weight. Eat less, exercise more, try and be in a calorie deficit. We know that doesn't actually help so much with things like lipedema. And so by moving to a different way of eating that does have some of these benefits, it allows us to go back to actually enjoying food again and take some of that pressure off feeling like we're constantly on that diet hamster wheel. Typically, we get body composition changes. Our clothes start to feel more comfortable. We have less inflammation, swelling, and pain. And I think all of these things come together and give us this greater sense of hope for the future, that we've found a way of managing some of our symptoms without all of the angst that potentially has gone with that in the past. So on, I think it was Tuesday or Wednesday, whenever we caught up earlier in the week, I talked about this vicious cycle that comes along with things like development of lipedema tissue. We tend to have, for whatever reason, and there's still a lot of debate over what the initiating factor is, that our fat cells, the adipocytes in our tissues, start malfunctioning, and rather than behaving in what we would consider to be a typical way, they start to they swell, they then become irritated. That then leads to inflammation in and around that tissue. There's a lot of speculation that this has to do with something going on, some sort of trigger happening in those cells, but also that we have more leaky fluid out of our capillaries, less capacity to remove that fluid through the lymphatic system, that in many ways that extra fluid in and around those cells, in and around those malfunctioning cells, sort of acts like a fertilizer and continues that process of these cells growing, becoming more irritated and malfunctioning. We then get what we call fibrosis, which is like scar tissue that happens in and around those cells. That scar tissue then tends to ooze out what we call like cytokines, other sort of immune modulating messengers that contribute to more inflammation in and around those cells, and that cycle just keeps going on and on. And so what we want to be thinking about is, how do we break this cycle? Where do we have the options to break this cycle? And certainly we need to think about some of those contributing factors to the cells, that inflammation. We know that there's usually a hormonal imbalance associated with this at some point, dysregulation of insulin, this overall blood sugar balance issue that may be going on. And interestingly, it's not so common for women with lipedema to end up with type 2 diabetes. They can down the track, but that's not usually one of the initial presenting features of this. But even without diabetes or even pre-diabetes, there's typically some sort of dysregulation of insulin and the role that insulin's playing. And insulin certainly could be one of these factors that's leading to some of the malfunctioning of the cells. I often think of insulin as being like a bodyguard, like, that big bustly bodyguard that's standing outside the cells and not letting anything in and not letting anything out, which makes it more tricky for those cells to do their normal functions and to detoxify and all of these sorts of things. So what we want to do is to break this vicious cycle. And often people then think, well, okay, keto is going to be a great opportunity to do that because it's naturally anti-inflammatory. It's going to stop some of that process of those adipocytes or fat cells getting bigger and bigger, leading to some of this inflammation. But it's not always straightforward. And so I just want to run through some of the challenges that I see typically when people talk to me and they say, yep, I've tried keto, it didn't work for me. I had an initial weight loss and then nothing really happened. This is actually really common, and I think it's important to sort of clarify what we expect the trajectory to look like. Weight loss, we've been led to believe, should always be, linear. For instance, you look up a diet online and it may say, if you eat this way, you're going to lose 2 pounds every week ongoingly. Now, the reality is for most of us, that doesn't actually happen, but it sets us up of thinking about, I should be losing a certain amount of weight every single week on week on week. I should be dropping kilos or pounds. But weight loss doesn't happen like that. Typically, weight loss is our number one metric that we're looking at because we can measure it. But weight loss isn't linear. And I can't remember where I found this slide, but it really just kind of shows us a little bit about what we would expect this process to look like. So we may initially get a water weight loss in the first few weeks when we move into testing out how a ketogenic diet can help us. And, sometimes this can be quite significant. Like I've had people say to me, I lost 8 pounds in 2 weeks, which, is amazing. Any sort of dietary intervention that has that sort of result seems almost like a miracle. But then they say to me, then it just stopped. And I think that's because we lose the water weight for a number of different reasons that happens. But then over time, our body plateaus out and it's just trying to do some underlying healing work in the background before we have another sort of slow and steady drop. And then we may end up with another plateau. I think it's just really important to recognize that it's going to be unique for each of us. It's not going to constantly follow that downward trajectory, but our body has a lot of underlying healing work that needs to be happening, and being patient with this process is really beneficial. And sometimes the scales don't show the benefits that we're actually experiencing in our body. And that's another thing that I typically hear in this community is they say the scales haven't even changed, but my clothes feel more comfortable. I can see it in my face. I can see it on parts of my body. And, it seems a little bit counterintuitive because we think if our body's changing, then surely those numbers should be changing on the scales. But it's not necessarily always the case that happens in that way. And we just need to continue to be patient and allow the process to kind of do its magic in the background. The second challenge that I often hear from people is, or that we need to be mindful of in this community, is that we are all biologically or biochemically unique. We call this bio-individuality, and really it's what we need to think about is that even though we may all come together and have a similar condition like lipedema or lymphedema, genetically we're different. The environments that we are living in, that have lived in the past, are going to be unique to us. Therefore, the sorts of exposures we've had to different sorts of toxins, or whether we've been in a moldy environment, or whether we live in a sunny environment or more of a less sunny environment, these aspects all play a role in our bio-individuality, the current state of health that we come to this diagnosis with. Very rarely would I have somebody that I speak to that only has a diagnosis of lipedema or only has a diagnosis of lymphedema. Typically, there is a cluster of other things that come with this. Some of the typical ones that we talk about are hypermobility is really common, both being potentially connective tissue disorders, hyperthyroidism, digestive troubles, IBS, other sorts of inflammatory bowel disease. These are kind of common when we come along with this. Arthritis, whether it's rheumatoid or more typically osteoarthritis, also tends to come along with this. So we need to be mindful about all of the factors of our health that are going on. And this last one, while we may kind of dismiss this as being not relevant, I actually see our stress load as being highly relevant to the conversation. And certainly the last, I guess you'd say the last 3 years have been an interesting journey in terms of things like the COVID pandemic and the added layer of stress that's added. We also have like a lot of financial stress going on these days in terms of things like high interest rates, inflation, all sorts of things that just add to the load that we are already carrying. And all of these factors play a role in both, one, how well our body responds to a ketogenic diet, what underlying other underlying healing has to happen for us to help our bodies get to that state of feeling healthy enough to be releasing this weight. I mentioned this the other day in our talk about why testing out keto can be helpful, but keto is often put across as being a one size fits all. For instance, you just follow this plan, you do this forever, and all will be well. But in my experience, there is no one size fits all, and we do really need to be thinking about adapting this to what we know about ourselves, what's going on with these other underlying health conditions, what's happening in terms of our stress load, the environment that we are finding ourselves in. And we need to navigate all of these things. And I don't say this to add just one more layer to everyone's experience. Really, the reason I'm saying this is that, we want to be thinking about navigating our ketogenic way of eating and personalizing it to us and what we know about us and our health. Another challenge that often comes along, especially in this community, is that we have spent so much time in the past dieting in such a conscientious effort of trying to manage our body composition that the longer we've dieted in the past, it seems that the body is going to be more reluctant to drop any of that weight. And so again, we'll be putting in, the effort, but we're not getting all the results. I hear this from people that are younger, that probably don't have decades of dieting history, that they do seem to respond faster to any type of intervention. And it just seems to me, and there's certainly research that bears this out, the more times we've been through that diet cycle where we've restricted calories, our body's gone into that sort of shocked state of, oh, you're starving me. It's slowed down the metabolism to match our food intake. We've kind of given up on that, gone back to eating what we were eating before, got fed up, started to diet again. And the more times we've been around that dieting merry-go-round, the more reluctant our body's going to be to release weight. That said, we do need to make sure that we're following some fairly robust guidelines in terms of eating enough, but not eating too much. And so, that can be an interesting challenge that we need to navigate in terms of making keto work for us. Now, another challenge that can come along is that in the early stages, we can get into a state of ketosis by eating in this low carb ketogenic way. We can start to use things like keto test strips and see that our bodies are in ketosis, but it can take some time for our body to catch up. Just being in ketosis doesn't mean that our bodies have become well adapted to eating in this way. And there's another term that you might read about or hear about that says it's called being fat adapted. If we think about the way that our body's biochemistry typically works, if we're eating a normal everyday Western diet, we're eating a lot of carbohydrates that are turning into glucose in the body, and our body is burning those for fuel. That's, I guess, the most simple way for our body to be getting energy. And the vast majority of the world live in that state. If we're trying to move into more of a ketogenic state, it's almost like we're trying to change over the machinery of our energy producing system. So rather than burning carbohydrates and glucose for fuel, we're trying to get our body into that state of burning the fat that's inside those adipocytes, those fat cells, and we're using that as our preferred fuel source. It can take a little bit of time, and the longer that we've been living in that sugar burning state, the more it takes for us to become really adapted to our body using the fat that's stored in those fat cells as fuel rather than using that glucose. And so typically we can get into a state of ketosis, as little as 2 days, but typically sort of 3-4 days of lowering our carbohydrates, we can technically be in a state of ketosis, but it can take anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks for our body to become more comfortable in this way of eating and in this way of fueling our bodies and fueling ourselves. So we need to, again, just allow ourselves that time and not make an early determination that this isn't right for us if we're still in this adaptation stage. Really, I guess, the thing that's probably keeping coming through as I've talked about some of the challenges that can come along with trying to adapt to a ketogenic way of eating is that we need patience. And let me just say, I'm probably the most impatient person around. If I try something, I want immediate results. And I think for many of us in this community, because we've tried so many things in the past, we too potentially are a little bit impatient. We want things to happen fast, but it is imperative that we allow ourselves the time to really just test out how this is working, test it out with some curiosity, and see where we can make little tweaks here and there to try and make it as practical for us, as beneficial for us as we possibly can. So this question, how do we know when we need to start tweaking things or whether we are stalled or plateaued in our weight loss goals because of food choices and other factors? So I guess this is just another key thing to talk about. And Gail mentioned this when we first started talking today, but there are a lot of different ways that we can do a keto way of eating. There's a lot that's available free and readily online. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the way that we recommend to do keto. Not only are we trying to get our bodies into a state of ketosis, we're also trying to plug maybe some nutritional gaps that have developed over many years of dieting. We're also trying to help some of these other underlying conditions that may be going on in our body. I often get asked the question, is lipedema autoimmune? And there's certainly no hard research to show that it is an autoimmune process that's happening in the body in terms of one of those initial triggers that lead to this. But what I do often see is that other autoimmune conditions come along with lipedema. So I don't know whether this is one of those, watch this space. In another 10 or 20 years, we will probably have more clarity of whether there is an autoimmune component somewhere along the lines to developing this. And I don't want you to go away from the conversation today thinking, oh, lipedema is autoimmune. But what I say to people is often other autoimmune conditions are happening in the background. If we have a propensity to autoimmunity, we don't really have the technology at this point to check and say, where are all of the areas in our body that this autoimmune process is going on. But if this is the case, we need to start thinking about what else may be driving some of the lipedema. And that may have to do with us eating foods that are certainly ketogenic foods, but they may be foods that are contributing to our body having some sort of autoimmune response or some sort of inflammatory response to the foods that we're eating. And I guess a couple of the common ones here that are really keto-friendly foods are our nuts and seeds, eggs, and dairy. These are foods that are highly, highly recommended and included in a ketogenic diet, but we do need to think about whether they're working for us and whether they're working for us right now. So this little slide here is from one of our other coaches here at Lipedema Simplified. She was doing a bit of a trial back earlier in the year. She's often suspected that dairy isn't her friend. And what she found is, and this was at the end of December last year, each time that she ate dairy when she was doing her weigh-ins, this is what she was noticing. So whilst, like I've said, dairy is highly encouraged in a ketogenic diet, it wasn't right for her. And so we need to think about whether there could be some underlying food intolerances that are hampering our efforts. And the only way really that we're going to be able to work this out is by tracking in a similar way to what this coach did, that she noticed the times when she was eating dairy, she was keeping a fairly consistent food diary, that she could see this correlation. And what you'll notice is just as quickly as she had these spikes, how quickly things changed afterwards. So these spikes, and I don't have on this graph like how much she put on. But say this was a 2 kilo or 2 pound spike after a post-Christmas piece of cheesecake, I think she said it was, that she got this spike. But once she stopped eating dairy again, how quickly this came back down. So this wasn't true weight that she was putting on in terms of adding more fat into the body. This was an inflammatory response. Her body was trying to dull down some of that inflammation that the dairy had contributed to by holding on to more water weight. And you can see how each time it's very quickly come back. And so, again, this is a way that we can often measure. And most of us here at Lipedema Simplified would say, we'd love you to get rid of your bathroom scales. You know, they tend to lie to us in terms of when we're making progress, they're not actually showing us that we're making this progress. And so they can become very triggering. But there is a time when using some bathroom scales can be helpful if we're not actually looking at the true number on those scales, but rather we're looking at this sort of scenario when we're seeing a spike. If you can eat a food and put on a couple of pounds overnight, for instance, from eating that food, it's not likely that that food has contributed to you putting on that much additional weight. It's more likely one of these inflammatory responses. And this is a way of being able to try and work out whether your body's reacting in an inflammatory way to a specific food. Enviro Girls just said, is it dairy from all sources or any cow milk products? Again, there is no hard and fast rule. And I'm not saying everyone needs to avoid dairy, because there are many in our lipedema community that can tolerate dairy just fine. I'm just using dairy as an example here, that for this particular person, that she was getting these spikes. And again, I think you've raised a great question there. It may just be cow dairy that you're intolerant to, or it may be a particular type of dairy that you're intolerant to. Say you can't do cream, but you can eat some cheese because it's fermented, or you could eat some yogurt because it's fermented, and that fermentation process slightly changes the molecules. And this is where it's about testing it out. And what I'm saying here about testing it out by looking at what happens on the scales is a way of being able to gauge whether we're responding negatively for something. So many of us here in the Western world have had a lot of cow's dairy over time, and that can allow our bodies to set up some sort of inflammatory response to it. There are some that can tolerate things like goat dairy just fine, or camel's milk, or some of these other types of milk products perfectly well, but don't tolerate cow's dairy. And that could be because of a protein in the cow's dairy. It could be the way that those cows have been farmed, for instance. Some people find they can eat or drink or whatever, use A2 milk, but can't use normal cow's milk. So again, it's about experimenting and looking at yourself as really an experiment, and trying different things out and just seeing how you in particular respond. I hope that's given you a little bit more of an explanation there. One of the other things that can happen really fairly quickly after we test out a ketogenic way of eating, it's really easy to be highly motivated in those first few weeks where, you know, checking, we're using recipes, we've probably got some sort of meal plan where we've jotted down what we're going to be eating. But over time, we kind of can end up with this scenario. Some people call it carb creep, where rather than staying sort of under that recommended sort of 20 odd grams of carbohydrates a day for ketosis for us, we've kind of slipped out of that, and maybe now we're doing 30. It may be a handful of nuts here, it may be, you know, extra cheese there. It's very easy, if we're not being really conscientious, to sort of start to creep up in the amount of carbohydrates that we're eating, and then we're feeling like we're not getting the benefits that we want. And so again, this is something we need to consider. And I even put fat creep on here. And when I say fat creep, what I mean is, it seems to me, in my experience, that those of us in the lipedema community don't necessarily need the super, super high fat content that many do in terms of navigating ketosis, probably because we've stored some and we have some stored away. But again, this is very personal. What's going to be right for one person in terms of how much additional healthy fat they include in their ketogenic diet is going to be different from the next person. And so initially I say to people, if you feel like you're not getting all of the benefits from a ketogenic diet that you would like, it's really worth thinking about and going back to, I guess, the fundamentals and making sure that you haven't sort of crept up too high in those carbohydrates that's now hindering your body getting into ketosis. But also it's worth thinking about maybe the super high fat way of doing keto that's touted online isn't quite right for me, and playing around with the level of fat intake. One thing that I'm quite keenly aware of, and this is for me personally, my genetics just doesn't really respond well to super high fat. I don't have really beneficial genes in terms of my fat processing capacity. And so for me, I include healthy fats in the diet, but I moderate that based on what I know about my own genetics. Now, not everyone has access to their own gene data. So this may be something that you have absolutely no awareness of about your own personal ability to break down fats. But the way that we can test that out is just by trial and error. You know, having a week where we are eating higher fat, see what results we get. Have a week where we're doing more moderate fat, or even, you know, minimizing that fat. We do need at least 30 grams of fat every single day. So I wouldn't want you to go lower than that in terms of fat. Every single cell membrane in our body has a fat layer around its outer coating. Our brains are made mostly of fats and cholesterol, these sorts of things. So we do need to keep that level of up. We do need it for healthy hormones. So don't go to no fat, which is what we've sort of been encouraged in the past of keeping that fat really down. We do need some healthy fat each day. That does come from, you know, the fat that comes along with some of those proteins that we're eating, but things like avocados, that's that dairy if you tolerate it. There are lots of ways of making sure that we are getting enough healthy fats in the diet, but we need to be mindful that there's going to be a threshold for each of us about what works well and what doesn't. And we sometimes need to play around with these things and work out what's right for us specifically. We also need to think about whether there's any other underlying metabolic dysfunction. Our thyroid, that little gland that's in the front of our neck there, plays a fairly key role in things like our metabolism, and it's highly, highly sensitive to feeling like we're starving. If we have a history of a lot of calorie restricted dieting, our thyroid seems to be even more sensitive to times when we drop our food intake too low. So I think the research that I saw recently, and certainly it plays out in my client population, is probably half of people with lipedema have some sort of underlying thyroid dysfunction. Now, this doesn't mean that you necessarily have problems with your thyroid markers on your pathology. We can also have what we call cellular hypothyroidism, where you're making perfectly fine levels of thyroid hormones made here in the gland. So your pathology results look just fine, but for some reason your cells aren't receiving those thyroid hormones as adequately as we would like. And at this point, we have no way of testing how well our cells are actually receiving those thyroid hormones and doing their job. But we can start to look at symptoms. And if somebody has a whole raft of thyroid symptoms, but their pathology looks fine, we start to consider maybe there's something going on that's blocking the thyroid hormones getting into the cells and doing their job. And one of the things that can block that is eating far too few calories. So we need to be mindful of that. And I guess that brings up this interesting dilemma that very much we've been conditioned societally to the best way to lose weight is to eat less and exercise more. But it is highly possible that by doing this, we've set our bodies up to be very cautious about going back into a starvation mode. And it's affected our metabolism over time, that we just feel like we have to eat less and less and less. But it is really a common thing when I work with people with lipedema and other health conditions, that sometimes our first goal is actually to start getting people to eat more rather than eat less. And I'm sure there's people that are listening to this that are like, that makes no sense. But actually, we do need to get the body back into a position of feeling safe, that there's enough food, there's enough resources for some of these other processes in the body to be working really well. And just as a little aside to kind of give you a bit of an explanation of what can be happening, if we're not eating enough, our bodies are very smart. Our bodies say, well, right now, you're not eating enough, for instance, to support a healthy pregnancy and to have a baby. And so typically what it will do is we end up with what we call hypothalamic amenorrhea, where if we're eating way too little for too long, our hormone, our cycle stops because it's not a healthy time for us to be having a baby. And so if you think about that, the hormones, then we make less and less progesterone because we're not cycling, and our estrogen just goes up and up and up. And we end up with this situation where we have far more estrogen that's not balanced with our progesterone. And again, estrogen excess is one of the factors that has been sort of put forward as maybe a driver in some of the development of lipedema tissue. Now, again, there's a lot of research that's going on now. We don't know everything that we're going to know about lipedema, but this is just one factor that I find really commonly when I talk to people about what have you tried in the past, that they'll tell me that, you know, they can only eat 800 calories. Anytime they eat more than 800 calories a day, they put on weight. And this is because the body, for instance, has adapted down to that level, and it's changing some of these other hormonal factors that are going on in the background. And the first goal in a situation like this is very slowly, incrementally increasing that food intake back to what would be considered to be an appropriate level of food intake for health and well-being. And then we can start playing around with the composition of that meal. On the flip side, though, it could be that we are actually eating too much, or eating too much in terms of carbohydrates, or we're eating too frequently. Back in the 80s and 90s, there was very much this recommendation that we should just graze all day. You know, humans don't need to eat 3 meals a day. They can just graze. I think this has proved to be wrong. We actually need for a healthy digestive system to eat, have a big break, eat, have a big break. It allows our body to do a lot of that housekeeping work to keep our digestive tract healthy. If we're eating breakfast and then, you know, morning tea, then lunch, and then a snack in the afternoon, and then another snack, and then we're eating our dinner, and then we're having another snack before bed, it doesn't really give our digestive system time to be doing a lot of these healing processes, and that can contribute to more inflammation in and around the digestive tract. And just as another aside, we have a lot of lymphatic tissue in and around the cells of our digestive tract, and if we have inflammation in that digestive tract, that's going to be triggering these lymphatic cells, this lymphatic tissue, and it's going to be putting forward messages to the liver to make more lymph. So, you know, again, is this contributing, that inflammation in the digestive tract? Is it contributing to some of these drivers of lipedema, that we have more lymph fluid, that lymph fluid isn't maybe moving around as well as we would like? So in terms of eating less frequently, I really like to see people leaving ideally at least 4 hours between meals. Some people can go longer. Some people are starving after a couple of hours. This is a process that we can start practicing and developing over time. But some people even find it beneficial to bring in various different types of fasting practices, intermittent fasting or time restricted eating, where people are eating in a much narrower eating window. You've probably heard this in terms of things like 16-8, where people are eating in an 8-hour window and going 16 hours between, for instance, their last meal of the day and their first meal of the next day. There's certainly a lot of different ways that people can do fasting. That's a far more in-depth conversation than we can have today. But I always encourage people to start by at least trying to just eat the 3 meals a day. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner, with no snacks in between. when we lower the level of carbohydrates that we're eating, this becomes easier. Eating the fats and the protein heavier meals will allow us to go longer between meals. We won't have that same sense of hunger as we do if we're eating, say, a piece of toast for breakfast that's got some sort of sweet dressing or sweet sort of jelly or something on it. We get a nice rise in blood sugar and then it drops off and we're hungry by, 10 o'clock. We are likely to be eating, say, for instance, some scrambled eggs or something for breakfast. This is going to give us much more sustained energy and allow us to get to the next meal time without feeling like we want to just eat whatever we can find. Over time, then typically we become less hungry and it becomes easier to push our meals back and do more of what we would call that sort of time-restricted eating, where we're eating in a smaller window, which allows the body to do more healing work, because a lot of the healing happens when we're not eating. When we're eating, that's our body's focusing its resources on that digestion and absorption of the food. So there's some really profound benefits that come in those hours where we're not eating, typically overnight, that we get involved in some of those processes. Stress can certainly, I mentioned this earlier, but can be a dampener on our weight loss goals. And so we need to be thinking about the role that stress can be playing and realizing that we could be eating the best possible diet that we could be doing all the things that are recommended, but we're in a highly stressed state. That's going to be continuing to pump out a lot of cortisol in our body. That cortisol in our body then tends to try and release sugar from any places of storage. Our insulin can go up and we can stay stuck in that vicious cycle, even though we're trying to do all sorts of other things. So again, this is about finding some strategies that can mitigate or manage that stress response. We can't always get rid of all of the things that are causing us stress in our lives, of course, but we can bring in some practices that can be helpful to manage this so that we can just lighten the load across the board. So whether you're new to keto or well along your journey with keto, sometimes it can be really helpful to sort of push the pause button, take some time to regroup and work out what your next step is. If you're feeling like you're not getting all the benefits that you would be like to be doing or like to be receiving from this, then it can be really helpful just to stop and to regroup. And I don't mean stop eating this way. I just mean take a time to reflect and think, okay, there's a lot of factors that could be involved in this. Could there be some food intolerances that are hindering this? Could it be my stress level? Could I be eating too much? Could I be eating too little? And start to try and think about some other possibilities and start playing around with these and experiment with different aspects of your ketogenic way of eating and see what sort of responses you get. Taking this time to sort of pause and reflect on what may be going on. Have you ended up with some carb creep or some fat creep? This is what our small group coaching is about. And earlier in the week, we introduced our small group coaching, where we get together as with a coach like myself and up to 6 people. We work together in trying to navigate what's going on with specific people's keto eating regimes, and we try and really go back to those basics, get things sort of right for us and our biochemistry. And this is a great opportunity to work with a coach in a more cost-effective way. And during the process of working with a coach, my 3 recommendations and the things that I seem to say over and over and over when I'm coaching someone is we need to be assess. Don't just kind of come up with a plan and say, this is what I'm going to do forever. Our biochemistry is changing and adapting as we go through this process as well. So we do want to keep assessing, see if we're getting the benefits we want, see what else may be coming up along the way. We want to approach keto with a sense of curiosity. And rather than that feeling of, this is the last ditch effort to make a difference with myself and my lipedema, thinking about it as being an opportunity to experiment with ourselves, see how our bodies respond, keep tweaking as we go along. And one of the other things you'll often hear me say is that we need to find our personal barometer. And for the coach that I shared with you earlier, her barometer was noticing when that water weight was happening, when those spikes were happening with what she was eating. It gave her a lot of information about what was happening in her body. For me, I have psoriasis, and psoriasis flares up for me if I kind of deviate too much. And so that's my personal barometer. I also have hypothyroidism. So again, I feel like when I start to feel more fatigued, I start to think, what am I doing differently? Have I changed anything? How do I navigate this? But for every single person, that personal barometer will be different. I remember having one client that said to me, I know when I've really deviated too far because my elbow starts to ache. I think most of us would like that to be our barometer, because, you know, it doesn't impact so much of the things that we do each day. The elbow is going to be less significant than if we start to get, you know, arthritic pain in our hands, for instance. But for her, that was her barometer, and she was able to use that as a way of, you know, prompting her that it was time to regroup. And for each of us, that barometer is going to be different. For many of us with lipedema, that barometer is we start to notice swelling again, or we get the pain in our areas of lipedema. But again, it's going to be unique. So just to sort of remind you a little bit about what our small group coaching program's about, we're starting on Sunday night in the US. It's going to be Monday for those of us that are down under. Obviously, you can tell from my accent that I'm in Australia. But our small group coaching is a group of up to 6 people. We have 3 1-hour live group coaching sessions. These are typically at 6 p.m. Eastern time, usually on a Sunday evening, and we have 3 1-hour live Q&A discussion type calls later in the week. These are usually on a Thursday, again at 6 p.m. Eastern. That gives us 6 hours of time together, where as a group, we're trying to navigate our way around getting started with keto, sticking with keto, working out what's going to be beneficial for us with keto. We also have a private Facebook group where we can, you know, have a little bit of discussion. We share recipes, we share our wins, we share our curiosities. We also record all of these sessions, so you'll have access for those for 6 months afterwards. Often when we're trying to navigate something new, there's so much information to absorb that we sort of take various aspects of it, but we don't necessarily, you know, take on 100% of those sorts of things. So it can be really helpful to be able to go back and re-listen, especially to those live group sessions where we're sort of navigating and talking about how to manage a ketogenic diet, so that you can listen again at a later stage and think, oh yeah, that's right, maybe I need to incorporate that, or I wonder how that's working. So this is just a little bit more information. We'd love it if anyone's interested in joining. Gail's put the link here. Do also, you can reach out to me through the Facebook group or through the comments. Gail, do you mind putting my email in there as well? You can certainly reach out to me and ask some questions over the weekend. We are getting started on Sunday night though. So in terms of, again, what this is 6 hours of support plus a 5 private Facebook group. That's actually, in terms of dollar value, less than what you would pay for 2 individual coaching sessions. So it gives you a lot more access to information and support around getting started on a ketogenic diet. We have handouts, recipes. I'm a massive checklists and assessment person. So often things come up in these groups where someone says, oh, you know, I have a lot of hypothyroid symptoms, but I've always been told it's not my thyroid. Then, you know, you'll find that there's an assessment that we do. We try and look at what's going on with symptoms and think, well, okay, maybe you don't have overt hypothyroidism, but there is something going on here. How do we make sure that the ketogenic diet that you're eating is supportive of that? And that's where this provides a lot more personalized content to the needs of the group. And, you know, we've had some amazing experiences in our group coaching program where you end up with 6 people with 6 very different type situations coming into the group. but that group support is quite lovely in terms of feeling like you're going through this journey with other people that are doing it at the same time. And often people will ask a question based on their circumstances that you wouldn't have even thought about asking, but it becomes very helpful as you become more aware of what's going on with your health and well-being. So we're going to sort of open it up, I think, now, Gail, for any questions that people may have about trying to navigate a ketogenic diet, maybe about the coaching program. I didn't see a lot of questions come up in the chat, but please feel free to put questions in there, and more than happy to answer those in the last few minutes that we have together. No, you're all very quiet today. Do you have any questions, Gail? I mean, I guess we talk a lot about keto for lipedema, but yeah, it's always an interesting journey. I think you're one of those people that always faces your own health with that sense of curiosity about, I wonder what this is doing, or I wonder what that's doing.
But I also get to that point where I have like the foods that I eat. I just put it aside, because I find that what happens is I get fatigued. Now, I don't mean fatigued physically where I'm just going to stare at the ceiling all day because I can't. I mean, I get emotionally fatigued because I'm working so hard at be eating properly. Okay. It's not an easy thing. So I run out of steam. I just run out of, okay, I'm done. This is the food I buy. This is the food I eat. I'm going to think. I'm just going to eat the same thing over and over and over again. And so,
I think
that's what I do. I've been all my life. I mean, I would lose weight. I have lost the most amount of weight I have ever lost in my life at one time by following one program, 118 pounds.
Wow.
Which is phenomenal, right? And I got my lowest adult weight at that time. And I worked it hard. It was 118 pounds in 18 months. So it was very successful. But by the time I got to there, I was exhausted from the constant thinking.
Yeah.
So I took a break, right? And I could never get going on it again. I just couldn't do it. I'd look at it and I'm not again. I'm not going to because I was so emotionally exhausted. And
that diet mindset, it involves every single choice that we make all day, every day. And that's where that diet mindset, like obviously it had some profound benefits for you in terms of weight loss, but it does over time just become exhausting. And, when we talk to ladies about how do we navigate a nutritional approach to helping with lipedema, we're not talking about finding something that works for 6 weeks, 12 weeks, 18 months. We're talking about finding a way of eating that's going to be sustaining long term. And so we do want to move away from that diet mindset and just find a way of eating that works and supports us. And this is sometimes about testing out, playing around with this. If we do like variety, but most of us are creatures of habit. And so for some of us, it's really helpful to eat the same thing week in, week out. But for other people, they're like, no, I like lots of variety. And it's about understanding us and our needs and what works for us, what's going to make our way of eating sustainable long-term for us personally, not necessarily what works for the next person, but what works for us. I have some clients come to me and say, just give me a meal plan. Just tell me what to eat all day, every day, and I will just rinse and repeat. And yet in my mind, I'm like, oh, I couldn't do that. I like the variety. I I remember somebody once called it food porn, and I was like, oh, that's so funny. But I Google recipes and I like to try new things. And to me, that's exciting. But for other people, that's their worst nightmare. So again, it's about finding what works for us and finding a way to make it sustainable so that we get the maximum amount of benefits with the least amount of brain impact. Like you mentioned, that brain fatigue that comes from being in that diet cycle where we're constantly questioning ourselves about, oh, did I do it right today? That's hard. We want to find it.
And I fought cravings the whole entire time. I fought cravings. I beat myself to a pulp every time I ate a cookie. I mean, I cravings the entire time. I don't fight cravings like that anymore, but I ended up developing a pretty heavy anxiety around food.
Yeah.
Knowing that every bite I put in my mouth was hurting me.
Yeah.
And so I got a really bad, had a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, a lot of crying myself to sleep at night. I mean, it was just every single thing. So I was extraordinarily fatigued by the time I got through that. And I ended up, I was losing weight for a particular event. When that event was over, I took a deep breath and said, okay, I've done it. I'm taking a break, and I could never get back on, which was okay because I'm eating so much healthier now.
Yes.
Because because at the time I wasn't eating really very healthy. I really wasn't. I just wasn't.
Yeah. And this becomes the dilemma. It really does become a dilemma when we so desperately want to reach a particular goal. But in my mind, that health, long-term health, is not determined by the number on the scales. And in many ways we have to kind of move from that societal expectation that you're healthy if you're a size 4, 6, 8, whatever it may be. That's health. If you're not fitting into that mold, healthy. I know, right? And we all have our own bio-individuality. Genetically, some of us are going to be a size 4, like just genetically you could eat whatever you want and that's what your body's going to do. But there are others of us that, that's just not our chemistry. That's just not genetically where we're predisposed to be. And some of that's a bit of a mind shift in simply coming to accept that, okay, I'm not going to, look like I've, put up as my ideal that I think I should look like, but we can be healthy. And health and bringing down that inflammation is going to provide longevity, and it's going to make, whatever circumstance we're in easier to navigate and easier to manage. Now, I've just noticed a comment or question in the Facebook group about a client who has diabetes should be concerned about starting a ketogenic diet. I think this is very much where you would need to be considering what's going on. If it's type 2 diabetes, then starting a ketogenic diet can have some really profound benefits. Certainly, medications need to be managed very quickly. Once somebody moves into a ketogenic way of eating, potentially their medications are going to be too effective, and this needs to be done with the connectivity with their doctor. You don't just change your own medications, but you do need to work very closely with them in terms of lowering some of those medications if a person's on those. Type 1 diabetes is a different story. Certainly can have some really profound benefits from moving to a ketogenic way of eating, but it needs to be navigated more under more supervision. There's certainly a lot of stories of people that have found great benefits, but that's not necessarily what we're talking about here. And that would need to be more one-on-one type recommendations than maybe a group coaching. But for somebody with type 2 diabetes, there is so much interesting research about the role that moving to a ketogenic diet. And some people need to go from normal diet lowering carbs, lowering carbs, lowering carbs, until ultimately they get to a ketogenic diet. We don't necessarily want to shock the body, when there is some diabetes, and it allows for more subtle changes in management as someone progresses to that. But it's certainly something that is going to have some profound benefits. Why are so many doctors dismissive of keto? Right back when we first started talking today, Gail, we talked a little bit about that, and that is, people that may look up keto online think that all we're eating is bacon and fat, and a lot of doctors are dismissive of keto, but there are more and more that are coming out to understand that a therapeutic restriction of carbohydrates can have some profound benefits. A great book I would suggest reading is Ben Bickman's book about what's it called? Why we get sick. Yes.
Yeah.
And he's a researcher, and he lays out all of these fundamentals. And I think if more doctors could read books like that they would be far more open to this. And I would really love it if we could move away from the term keto, because I think there is a lot of concern that when we talk about someone getting into ketosis, that doctors think we're talking about keto. Why am I having brain zaps this morning?
Ketoacidosis.
Ketogenic acidosis, which is a complication of diabetes, where that they get so many ketones that it becomes damaging. We're not talking about that. We're talking about something that's different, that's a much more moderated level of ketosis. But for doctors, they kind of jump into, oh, this is dangerous. Whereas what we're talking about is naturally what we would have done across the calendar year, across the seasons and cycle in times past. So that book was called Why We Get Sick by Ben Bickman. I think that's the name of it. But if you put Ben Bickman into Google, his book will come up. And it's a really fascinating read. He probably doesn't go as far as saying, the level of ketosis that maybe we would be trying to do for lipedema. His recommendations are probably sitting more at the low carb towards keto, but he gives a lot of information about the science and about why this is helpful. And I guess I'm a bit of a research geek, so I like to understand the background of why something works, because then it becomes easier for me to stick to. Some people like that. Some people say, don't tell me why, just tell me what to do. So, it's different for all of us. Oh, Gail's just put it in. Great. Yep. So really fascinating.
And I've been dealing with the medical profession recently, with my family. And one of the things that happened was my husband's original cardiologist, his stuff when my husband said, well, I eat keto. Now he just lost his mind, right? And he was rude and obnoxious and literally lost his mind on my husband, and then came back and lost his mind on me after was done. And I was just like, okay, first of all, this is what he eats: whole foods. He doesn't eat processed foods. Are you telling me that there's a better way to eat than whole, unprocessed foods? How can that's what we're talking about. When we talk about keto for lipedema, we're talking about whole, healthy, beautiful,
real food that our body knows what to do with.
And, are you telling me he'd be better off eating the standard American diet than what I'm feeding him? And he's like, well, no, but, he shouldn't be eating meat. And I'm like, oh, okay, now I understand where he's coming from, because he's a plant-based person, right? And we are not. But we're still eating. I told him, I go to the grocery store, I buy whole vegetables. They come like this with a stem.
Yeah.
The label, except the code where you have to except the purchasing code, but they basically don't have an
No,
ingredient.
no barcode included, right?
A pepper is a pepper, an onion is an onion, right? I mean, it's like I do that. The package of meat just is meat. Just is, I mean, I'm going, are you telling me that the way I feed him is detrimental to his health as compared to the standard American diet? So don't tell me don't do keto, because he didn't even understand when we said keto. He picture keto treats. I don't know what they picture, because that's not the way we eat, right? We just, that's not the way we eat. And so I can't even imagine what he thought we were eating, because we were going keto. So really, I tell my husband, okay, let's not when you talk to your cardiologist, we don't use the word keto, because it makes them lose their minds, because they don't know what we're doing. So I understand. I mean, it was like you thought that he was going to go into angiogram and have to totally repair everything before he came back and said he doesn't have any artery issues except this one little spot, and he did it, and I'm thinking, and he didn't have to do anything in it. And I'm like, but he lost his mind when he heard the word keto.
And I think that, like I said, it's that phrase that's become, like people see it as being a fad, or it's, it's unhealthy. But there's a lot more research coming out all the time to say, maybe a lot of the health issues that we're experiencing in our society have to do from the high level of carbohydrates that we're eating. If we go back to what, not just our more recent ancestors, even a couple of 100 years ago, they weren't eating the same as we're eating now, where we have so much highly processed carbohydrates in our everyday diet, and it's causing or contributing to a lot of the issues. Our genetics haven't caught up with the way that we're eating. Our genetics match what they were eating, thousands of years ago. Not that I'm saying we need to totally replicate that, because we have to live in the modern world that we live in now, but certainly if we can cut out a lot of those highly processed carb heavy foods, especially the treats, then we're going to have a lot of profound benefits in terms of our own health ongoingly. And one of the interesting things for many of us with lipedema is that we're part of a family and part of bigger groups, right? So anything that we learn about ourselves and the benefits we have certainly are going to have some profound benefits for all of our family. Kristen said, I understand that we need a range of good fats to get into ketosis. Some keto ladies said that they were told to eat less. I missed it if you touched on this. Oh, yes, we certainly did touch on that, Kristen, the concern that, we're eating too few calories. And this is going to be very personal, but eating too little is equally as problematic as eating too much in terms of what it's doing to us metabolically. So, absolutely great that you brought that up. And we did talk about how sometimes the first step in this process is just over time being able to eat more to get our bodies back into that state of being, yep, I'm well fed, I'm well nourished. I can get these hormones back into what, doing what they're meant to be doing, and get a lot of this biochemistry back to doing what it's meant to do. And then we can start playing around with things like, proportions and of different types of macronutrients and all of those other sorts of things. So, yeah, eating too little can be problematic. And, we do need the good fats. I mentioned that we need at least 30 grams of fat every day. That's the minimum amount of fat that we can eat to keep things like hormones and other things running well. And for many of us, when we're eating in a ketogenic way, we benefit from more. It does seem to have some profound benefits in terms of satiety, helping us to get from one meal to the next. But again, this is one of those areas that we can play around and experiment a little bit. I mentioned that I don't do so well on the really high fat that many ketogenic diets would recommend. I do better on a moderate kind of fat, and that just has to do with my particular genetics. I can see that very clearly on the genetic panels that I've had done, that I don't metabolize those fats all that well. So, for me, it's about working out how I feel best with all of these different factors at play. But I think Gail, we're
thank
kind
you
of at
so
the end
much.
of our time. So
15 minutes over. What are you talking about?
yeah, well,
it's 5 minutes. Carrie, I feel like I've been running this, and it's not mine. This is your, this is your webinar, and I'm grateful that you've let me join you on these, and that we were able to have these conversations. I learn something from you every time.
Fun. It's always so fun talking to you, and I'm really passionate about helping spread the message about the role that our food choices play. I didn't come to nutrition always being somebody that was geeky about health. I came to study nutrition because my family had health concerns, and I think that becomes a driving force, doesn't it? When you're concerned about your health, then it's that motivation to learn more. And I feel like that's one of those, keep giving it forward. What was that movie, Pay It Forward? Like all the benefits that I've learned over time is, now we just keep paying it forward. And in this community, all of us keep paying it forward by sharing what's working, and that grassroots movement where we're learning more and more about what's beneficial, what's not, in terms of helping support lipedema.
Yeah, and I really hope that somebody out here in the audience has heard something that connected them. I just wanted to let you know that I put the link in there, sign up for group coaching. Put it right back in there, so it's in there a couple of times. And I think I'm really hoping that you have a wonderful group. I'm excited that you're starting another group on Sunday, right? In a couple of days. I can't wait to hear.
Yeah.
Can see you. But I hope maybe I'll have to do that, But anyways, you just let me know when you want to close out, Carrie.
Oh no, I think we're good. Anyone that's hung in here all this time deserves a medal. But we'll say goodbye for now. And thanks, Gail. Thanks to everyone that turned up. And oops, I think we've lost you, but we'll say goodbye now.
Guys, I'll get medals.